Okay, hey, my name is Josh, and I'm happy to be here at the DEF CON 206 group and at Black Lodge Research. And I'm going to talk to you guys today about home coffee roasting. So hopefully you guys are here because you like coffee.
Yes.
If you don't like coffee, hopefully you like the smell of it. so just to kind of give a quick intro, I've spent a good amount of time here at Black Lodge Research, so I really appreciate this facility specifically, and DEF CON for kind of inciting my interest in computer security. There will not be a lot of computer security aspects of this talk. It's mainly about coffee roasting, but at the last part of it, I do have a couple slides where I talk a little bit about potential opportunities for do-it-yourself coffee roasters and maybe modifying or hacking existing machines. So if you want that part, stick through to after the demo time and we'll talk a little bit about that. But another couple of heads up things is I'm trying to make this not seem kind of salesy or pushy. I'm going to talk about like machines, specific machines, but there's a variety of them and I don't have any stake in any of those machines. And then I do sell coffee myself, but I'm going to give you guys information on how to make the same coffee I make for about a quarter of the price I sell it for. So don't take it as like an attempt to get you to be customers, but if you do want to buy coffee, you can do that. So obligatory meme, I've added those through to make it not seem so dry, but essentially this is the reason I started doing this is because I love coffee, right? And in anything that I love, I start to dig into it, right? It becomes like a rabbit hole, and I go down that path of the way that to do it the best, right? To be the best at coffee consuming as possible. So I've talked a little bit about this, but the agenda today is just to talk about why I started roasting coffee, why you might want to do that. Types of coffee roasters. There's like these two different routes to go down, maybe even a third route, but I don't get into too much. But to talk about the different types of coffee roasters and the different price points for those. And then get into the stages of bean development, which is like when you're roasting coffee, the things you're looking for. I mean, it's a very visceral experience, right? You're using sight, sound, and smell, and then eventually taste, because after you roast the coffee, you're obviously going to drink it. But it's one of those things that it uses a lot of your senses. So I'm going to talk about how to pay attention to those with the stages of bean development. I talk about selecting green beans. I have a variety of green beans out here. Another friend brought a different sets of green beans, and there's a lot that goes into that, like what makes up the eventual coffee that you produce has a lot to do with the green beans that you choose. And then we're going to break from here, and we're going to go into the other room, and we're going to break into groups, and we're going to do some roasting. And that's probably going to be the majority of the time spent today is going to be using the different machines. We'll try to give everybody a chance to use any one of the machines they want, or all of them. And you'll leave with coffee. One of the machines that I have actually it actually produces a lot of coffee, so hopefully you guys are cool with taking home some coffee. There'll be no charge for the coffee. The only thing I ask is that you send back some notes on what you thought of it and stuff like that. So, and then at the very end, like I said, we'll talk a little bit about potentials for using the skill set that we culture here at the Black Lodge and in DEF CON groups for coffee roasting. So let's get into coffee roasting. So, we're in Seattle. People really like coffee here, and I love coffee. And this is renowned as an area for a lot of coffee connoisseurs. Oh, let me turn this off. So that's what got me into it, right? So I started out with just upgrading my coffee maker, and I think a lot of people do this, right? Where they're drinking coffee and they're like, I kind of like this coffee, and they say, well, you know what? Just making it in this percolator isn't quite the right thing to do, or maybe this isn't getting me what I want. So I started going down this route of well, I'm going to try French presses, or maybe an AeroPress. Maybe I'm going to try a pour over or an espresso machine. And eventually I realized, well, the grinder has a lot to do with this, right? So I'm like, well, I'll get a different grinder, and I try these different varieties of grinders. One of the first espresso makers I have is called the Rocky, the Rancilio Silvia, and that comes with this other kind of conical burr grinder. And I was like, well, maybe I need a better grinder, and that actually does play a big role in it, right? So the coffee maker has a lot to do with it, with great coffee. The grinder has a lot to do with it. Went crazy with buying good grinders, and then all the way down to manual grinders, where I didn't bring one today, but I have this little hand grinder where you just rotate it, and there's something awesome about. I guess I tend to enjoy coffee where I sweat a little bit to make it, right? So I'm sitting there in the morning grinding this coffee on trips, and that has a lot to do with it too. And I talked about this earlier, but there's this whole realm of like coffee connoisseurs that get into different types of pour overs and stuff. Like yesterday I had a Chemex show up at my house, and it's just this beautiful piece of blown glass, and half of it has to do with having something that looks pretty on your counter, and the other half has to do with actually the way it prepares coffee. You can really control the timing and the temperature and different aspects of the way the beans work when you get into this world of like pour overs and AeroPress. But eventually all those things led me and other people that do home coffee roasting to say, well, that's the part I'm not controlling, is the beans, right? So I can go and buy coffee from Fred Meyer's or Safeway in those big bins that'll look all glazed with oil that you just pull the little thing down and they just come out bulk, right? Or I can go and buy like coffee from like Pete's or like Starbucks, and you start to get better quality coffee. But at a certain point, they all start to become stale, right? So even the great coffee that's a better quality bean, if it was roasted 3 weeks ago or a month ago, it starts to become stale. And there's this difference with coffee that's fresh roasted. Even lower quality coffee that's fresh roasted tastes better than good quality coffee that's stale, right? So it just started pointing towards the fact that like I need to start looking at either buying beans that are really freshly roasted or roasting them myself. And luckily for me, you can get into coffee roasting pretty easily. So all of this kind of leads up to the fact that I started to get very serious about my coffee, right? More so than most people. Like years ago, I was fine with any like black mud that come out of like one of those percolator pots, or but slowly I've got to the point where I just have a hard time drinking coffee unless if it's good. And it sounds kind of snobby, but eventually you get into that thing where you start to taste the differences, right? And especially when you get into coffee roasting. So I'm going to get into roasters basics. Essentially, that's what got me to the point where I started considering roasting coffee. And I'm going to pause here for a minute and say that there are people that are good at this, and like there may be some people here that feel free to jump out and correct me in situations if you know better or worse than this. I'm self-taught. I'm completely self-taught on this. I didn't take any barista classes or roasting classes. This is me over the course of the last couple years fumbling through and figuring things out. And much like in the security industry or in any other computer industry, people that are self-taught should have enough humility to say, hey, like if something isn't right, let me know. So just feel like jumping out if you need to talk about this. But the two basic roasters that we have, and we have an example of both of these outside, is drum roasters and fluid bed roasters. I briefly brought up a third type, which is kind of like this. I've seen people use this cast iron skillet method where they're actually cooking them either in like a pressure cooker or in a cast iron pan, and they're just kind of right over a pan. They're quickly moving them around. They're like agitating. But I believe that is a form of a fluid bed, right? So it's kind of a derivative of this. But essentially, the two big ones that most people get into is either fluid bed or drum. And the difference between those two is that a fluid bed roaster is like a hot air popper that has hot air just blowing through like a channel, and the green beans are sitting on there, and they're heating up because of the air blowing through it. So it's kind of like a convection oven, right? So they're heating up through that. Whereas a drum roaster has some source of heat near or behind or below a drum that's just slowly rotating, and the beans are getting a form of conductive. It does still have some convection heat. There's still fans and air that's flowing around, but the beans are agitated because of the rotation of the drum, and it's heating it a slightly different way. And there are some pros and cons to each. Like most people that get into large commercial settings will end up doing the drum roaster one for a variety of reasons, but mainly because you can do super large capacities, right? You can do 20, 30 kilograms at a time, right? Whereas like for the fluid bed roasters, you kind of cap out at like 4 or 5 pounds, maybe 10 pounds with some really good ones. The fluid bed roasters are easy to clean up, and you can roast really fast, right? They remove all the chaff. The chaff isn't going to be inside like the some drum roasters will deal with that.
What's chaff?
Oh, good point. Okay. So let me talk about the beans for a moment. So coffee beans themselves start out as cherries, and then those cherries, the people that process and sell the green beans to us, they husk the cherry off, the pulp around the outside of the cherry off, and then they prepare it by either doing they prepare it by either doing a drying method. What's the name?
Dry process.
A dry process or a wet process, right? And so after it's processed, either a dry process or a wet process, the beans, as you start to cook them, they'll get to this stage where the outer shell it's called the chaff, will right towards the stage where it's called first crack, that'll fall off. That portion, which is like a little skin. Almost imagine like a peanut has like that chaff around the outside of it that's on the inside of the outer shell. So as you're cooking the coffee beans, that portion will come off. And inside of a drum roaster, a lot of the drum roasters will have the chaff in here. So one of the benefits of a fluid bed roaster is that the chaff actually is blown off because of the hot air blowing through it. So there is some argument to be made. There's like debates amongst coffee roasters about the pros and cons to each one of these, but there is a flavor argument that drum roasters have a more full-bodied flavor, and that fluid bed roasters end up having more acidity to them. So the drying stage of a fluid bed roaster, they actually cook much faster. So so what happens is the chemical process that happens inside of the bean happens much quicker, and there's some side effects to that. So there's some flavor arguments to be made about fluid bed roasters, though there is a lot of debate about there. The people that are incentivized to want to promote fluid bed roasters are producing like research that says that you can't really taste the difference in a cup, but people that do blind tests say that sometimes fluid bed roasters have a different taste, like not as much body. So hopefully I've covered it. I don't know if there's other things that I can, go ahead.
Can you explain what body means?
Okay, what's the best way to describe body for coffee? So I'm going to talk about different types of coffee beans later on, but traditionally in America, we've been used to like a Colombian coffee, which has like this kind of thick, how do you describe body to it? It's like a texture or a flavor. It's kind of,
the weight that you feel on your palate.
Yeah.
And the more weight you feel in your mouth, you usually describe that as being heavier body. It's a lot like wine.
Yeah. There is a lot of correlations between people that go down this route of like trying to perfect the art of coffee to like those that like do this with wine or beer, like home brewing. But essentially I'd say how wide the flavor is, like how thick it feels, has to do with body. And then there's lighter fruity notes in roasts that are completed earlier. I have a chart later on that kind of talks about this, where it's the natural flavors of the beans will come out more when you stop the roast earlier in the roasting process, and that is not, those are argued to not have as much body to them. So I don't know if I'm describing this right, but yeah, okay. You can tell I'm self-taught. I learned all these all myself. So these are the traditional drum roaster options. So I have one of these Beemores outside, and it looks pretty much just like it looks like a toaster oven, right? Like you'd see in a traditional toaster oven. And what it has is, it's about, I think it's in the $300 range. I think it's right around there. But on Amazon, you can get them refurbished for a little bit less. But it's a good price point for people that just want to start, right? And you can do about a pound at a time in there. After the bean loses its weight that it loses during the roasting process, which I'll get into a little bit later on, you get about 3/4 of a pound. And it has a drum in there that just rotates slowly with a couple ceramic rods that are heating it up, much like a toaster oven, right? And then, so we have the Hookie here, which is about $1,200. We also have an example of one outside, thanks to Chris, that brought one. And this is definitely a step up from that. You can produce more, I think, on this one.
I believe so.
Yeah. And then, but you got a lot more control over this one, right? This is very manual. And you can actually really fine tune the curve, which is the roasting profile of the bean. And I'll get into that a little bit more later on too. There is, these ones right here are called the North Roasters, and there's a company in the Midwest called Mill City Roasters that sells these, but they're generally made from a manufacturer in China. You can import them directly. And they're in the $3,000 to $5,000 range. And you can buy these in like 2 kilogram, 3 kilogram, and on up models. Like I was considering getting a 2 kilogram one of these, but they produce much more and faster than the rest. But they're still fundamentally the same thing. You see the same shape exists, like you have this cylinder here with the drum, much like the Hookie, and inside of the Beemore. And then this is the ProBat is the ones that like the guys next door would use. This is the big commercial coffee roasters. And they can do 50, 60 pounds at a time or more. So the other kind is fluid bed roasters. And I think that they were more recently discovered. There's this guy, Civet, I think, I forgot what his name is, Civets. that discovered these more recently and started to pioneer this space. But the first one there is a do-it-yourself version of it, and this is a good entry point, comparable to the Be More. So a lot of people will get into this, getting a certain type of air popper. I think it has to be the ones that brings in air from the outside. There's two different types of air poppers, but air popcorn poppers, and you can modify them to work as a coffee roaster. And you can see in the picture there that people have some green beans there, and you just hook up a probe, and then you can test, as long as you know what the bean temperature is, you can roast them in there. Even without knowing, you can go off of sound and off of smell to roast inside of a popcorn popper. One of the limitations of that is you can only do like a quarter pound. It's a very small amount you can do in that. Same thing with this fresh roast. This is like, I think about $200, maybe 100 to $200. I never bought one of these, but this is really popular on Amazon. You can find those, and they roast enough for like a personal supply, maybe for a week at a time. And then you get into the more commercial ones. You're kind of prosumer to commercial, and that's us here in Seattle. Luckily, both of the companies that make these are based in Washington, right? So these guys are up north in Burlington, I purchased one of these. We have one outside there. They are the more commercial fluid bed roasters. They can do like up to 2 pounds at once. So I roast inside of one of these like 2.8 pounds of green beans, and it yields about 2 pounds, depending on the density of the bean and how much loss it gets. Here's another one that's from over by Spokane, the Artisan. They actually sell something very similar. It's like you see a chamber here where you can see the coffee roasting. It just blows hot air through there and tests the temperature as it's going out. And the other machine here is a way of cooling them down quick, which I don't get into this talk, but there is some definite effects on the coffee and the way that you actually cool down the coffee, much like heating it up. So before we go on break and go and actually test out these machines, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to pay attention to different coffee, the way that coffees develop. So I found these charts online, and I actually tried to link to where I got them from because I realized this was going to be recorded. But essentially, most people are used to paying attention to coffee in these three buckets, like light, medium, and dark roast. And when you're roasting coffee, there is some stages that happen as the coffee's roasting, right? The coffee starts out green, and as you get to the point where it's drinkable, it's after the first crack. So right before this city or light roast, there's going to be the coffee is going to go from this like green to like this tan, and then it'll start to get to a light brown, and then it's going to crack. And that's generally when coffee becomes drinkable. It's going to smell during that phase. It's going to smell like kind of like burnt grass or hay. It does not smell appetizing at all up until that point. One caveat I would say before this point is like there's a new trend for white coffee, and I think white coffee is actually being pulled before first crack. So it's very early in the roasting process. But it doesn't really taste like coffee. If you've ever had white coffee, it tastes completely different than coffee. The flavors that you are used to associating with coffee come inside of these stages. So at a very high level, it starts out with first crack, and then there's going to be a second crack that'll happen, and the different stages of coffee come from how close it is to that second crack and the darkness and color. So most people are used to like a medium to dark roast. Lighter roast is more for the people that are doing pour-overs and stuff like that. But it would be after the first crack completes, which sounds like popping popcorn, and right before or in the second crack, which sounds more like Rice Krispies cracking, right? So people have seen this like French roast and stuff like that, like Starbucks sells a French roast. They're roasting it to about the darkest you would ever want to go, right, for a French roast. And there's different methods of brewing coffee that are associated with these different roast levels, right? So like this would be like a French press or like maybe espresso machine, whereas this is more of where I would do like a drip coffee maker, right? Where I do like medium for like if you had like a 10-cup, regular standard drip coffee maker. And then over here would be like if you're doing like a pour over, like a Chemex or something like that. So I'm going to go through a bunch of pictures that are on Sweet Maria's guide. Sweet Maria is a website that sells bulk green coffee to people, and they cultivate this home roasting culture. And they have a really good guide that helps you understand what beans look like and like how they'll actually look as they develop for the different levels of coffee. So this is like unroasted. This is like level 1, right? And this is what you would see most beans you would buy from like some sort of supplier. And you can see as you go along here, it starts to get darker and get drinkable. So I skip forward to 7, which is right here. And this is about when first crack begins. This is what the coffee will look like when it's starting to do first crack. And you can see here, some of the beans have actually cracked. And this is right about when coffee becomes drinkable. And you'll hear it and smell it in the machine. It starts to change. And you'll see that, that the beans have cracked. In the fluid bed roaster, it's a little easier. The fluid bed roaster has a chamber that you can look at the coffee as it's roasting. Inside of the drum roasters, you might have to pull a sample out in the more expensive models to see. So those ones are generally more going off of either the sensors in the machine or sound or smell rather than sight. So after first crack, the first level that most people roast to is called city roast, and that's level 9 right here. The beans are looking like that. And so we're going to kind of go through up to like French in different levels. City plus roast is still somewhat of a pour-over type coffee. It's a very light coffee. You can see it looks pretty light. So right as you're getting close to second crack, you're in this range. You're starting to get to the more of the medium roast, right? So this is like full city roast. And I'm going to talk a minute about timing between these first and second crack. The different machines have different ways that they progress from first to second crack. But the machines that I'm used to, the Bmore and the Sana Fresco, those are about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes in between first and second crack. And in order to kind of help understand, when we're on the verge of second crack, I'll keep a journal that says, that's like a historical version of what each one of these coffees took. So I'll be marking it down so that I can make an educated guess on when I'm on the verge of second crack. Because some people really like the full city roast, but they don't like full city plus, which is when you're in second crack, right? So this is kind of a guessing game. You start to get to know the beans for a while, right? That's hard to do when you're buying small quantities of bean. You got to buy a large quantity of beans to get to where you can do a full city roast and not a full city plus. So then you start to hear second crack and you're in full city plus. So now we're down here at, over here. This is what people are used to seeing for like major, normal drip coffee machines. And then Vienna roast is when second crack is rolling. Let me talk about what the term rolling means. You'll hear people talk about this a little bit. Each one of the cracks that happen, the first and the second crack, there'll be the first audible snaps, which is the very beginning of it. But the measurement you generally want to measure is when it's rolling. So rolling first crack would be like when the bulk of the beans are starting to snap, right? So you're in, instead of a rolling second crack or first crack. This one, for a Vienna roast, right here on 13, you're waiting till you're in a full, the second crack is rolling. It's not like outlier beans have cracked. They'll always be there, especially in drum roasters. Sometimes a bean will get caught in the outside of the drum, and that one, because it's closer to the heating source, more often will crack sooner than the body of the beans. So French roast is where you'll start to see the oil on the beans. And I want to point out that too, like normally if you're used to seeing like oily beans, what you're talking about is beans that have been roasted dark. And that's a good sign if you see those on the beans that you're doing, that you've roasted them to the darkness. But this is after second crack is nearing its end. So we're at 14 here. And this is the longest you want to roast coffee, is when you start to see oil or the second crack is ending. Because after that, you get this carbonized, like very bitter kind of charred tasting coffee. And actually, I shared the slides with someone before I came in here, and I was going to talk a bit about that. Is some of the larger companies will use that charred coffee as a way to normalize the way the beans taste, because they have different coffees that are in season at different times. So they'll roast it to a darker flavor, because now the flavor of the charring outweighs the flavor of the beans and the variation of the beans. So again, here's another thing from Sweet Maria's that talks about how you can tell what different coffees look like. Sorry, this is off the side here, but you got a city roast, which is like a light roast, and the beans are they almost look similar to that, but when you grind them, you can tell this is a lighter roast, right? And then you got more of a, what's it, full city, you can see it here. Full city is kind of a medium roast, and the beans look similar, but when you grind the beans on the inside, they've cooked to a darker color. And then you got a light Vienna, which is like a darker coffee, and it's even a darker coffee. You can see the differences between the colors there. So This slide, you know, I ripped this off from the internet, but I give credit here, but it essentially talks about the difference between that first and second crack in the flavor of the coffee. So when I was talking earlier about people that want to do like things like pour overs and stuff like that, the way they want to, the way they prepare coffee, a lot of people will get into like realizing or discovering that there's these other flavors to coffee other than the kind of charred, like the brown line here, like this, like the burnt flavor or the caramelized flavor, the carbonized flavor of coffee. And those people are probably liking coffee that more peak after the first crack, because the natural flavor of the bean peaks right after this first crack point and then starts to degrade as you get closer to second crack, right? So a lot of people that like that kind of pour over method or want to taste these other flavors in the coffee are looking for coffee that has shortly after rolling first crack, they just cut it off, right? Whereas the flavor that people are used to tasting that don't go down this route of like this rabbit hole of going crazy on coffee quality are used to tasting the flavor of the roast, right? Like an actual roasted flavor, a caramelized flavor. So you can see, this also talks about the different things you'll see as you're roasting the coffee, so pay attention to the way it smells. Like when it's yellow and drying, it smells like cut grass. It doesn't smell good, right? After first crack, it starts to smell like coffee. You know something's happening here, and you're starting to hear the popcorn here. And then afterwards, you'll, when you get towards second crack, you start to see a little bit of smoke. If you have a machine that'll show the smoke, like the Be More, well, you'll see a little bit of smoke coming out. And you'll hear this, like the sound of Rice Krispies, right? It starts to sound a little different, and it's getting really dark. And then it's burnt here. This last slide just talks about what not to do. This is when it's like charcoal and ash, and it, you know, it just looks bad. So, yeah.
Is bitterness a function of the scale from up there?
It is, right? So bitterness starts to come in here, but it also has to do with the roasting curve. And I don't get too much into that here because it, you know, there's people that have PhDs in coffee roasting that really get into the chemistry of coffee. But in between first and second crack, the amount of time you let it develop has an effect on the bitterness of the coffee. So the speed at which you're roasting and the speed at which you go from first to second crack affects that bitterness. And also, the origin of the coffee affects that too. And I get a little bit into green bean selection here that'll affect bitterness. But you find the coffee beans that you like or that you're roasting, and then you can affect the bitterness by kind of going more towards that first crack. So here's the machine I have, the Sonafresco. One of the benefits of when you get out of the first, you know, the entry-level machines is you can start to like track them with like software. And I actually have a Surface Pro here that has a Bluetooth connection to the roaster out there, and you can track the profile. And essentially, this lets you see in here when first crack is, and then control how fast it's ramping up in temperature afterwards, right? So I can start to build profiles for the beans I have and say, hey, this bean, it does better when I actually stretch out this time here or when I dry quicker. Another thing that's interesting from this standpoint is that fluid bed roasters have a really fast drying phase. It's hard to get that fast of a drying phase in other types of roasters. So it works well for some beans like high mountain beans, right? So because you want to get through that drying phase into Maillard phase later on. These terms, Maillard and drying phase, if you want to dig more into the chemistry of what happens inside of coffee beans, you probably should, either I should do a second talk or sometime after this.
In cooking, and like stovetop cooking, they talk about Maillard and use water to like break it up, but then it forms it for better flavors, like you're cooking like pulled pork and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Kind of the same
Yeah,
idea.
there are the ways that the sweetness comes out of coffee. There's a chemical process that happens during this phase. It's after the drying phase into there's an ROR stage that I'm not necessarily familiar with. Then after that, it gets into this Maillard phase and then the development phase. So yes, there is some aspect. You can't add water to a roast as it's roasting. Yeah. So it's a matter of controlling the temperature and the fan speed. And
it is the same chemistry though. So when you cook a steak, it turns brown. Coffee, it reacts the same way.
Yeah.
Same exact process.
And people are trying to extend that, like that phase where it's starting to get sweet, where the carbonization, the caramelization is happening. They want to extend that. So on the Be More, you guys will be able to do this too. I'm gonna have you guys roast in manual mode, and you're gonna turn down the heat after you hear first crack, and then turn up the drum speed so you're going to try to extend out that first to second crack. So you'll get a chance to actually see how you can affect that. Whereas on my machine, the Sauna Fresco, I have to pre-make a curve, and then it just plays it out. It'll report on where it's at. This red line is it's reporting where it's at on that stage, but you can't control it. Like the Huki has, you can control it live as you're roasting. You can say, oh, actually I want to slow down, this aspect of it or heat up that aspect. So, okay, so let's get into green beans here. So another image I found on the internet. This is talking about the source of different beans and what they mean to body and what they mean to like the actual flavors. So a lot of people like this Hawaiian coffee, and this is like a mild-bodied coffee. It's low-altitude coffee, and it has like, you can describe it this way, like it's very subtle. It's kind of a smooth taste to it. And as you get into the more traditional coffees, like Brazilians, I think this is like what you would see here and then up here, like like the Folgers and U-Bands and stuff of America. What people have grown up on is kind of either this level or this level. Espresso machines also generally have Brazilians, but they're like smooth and sweet. This is like that, the reaction will make the coffee sweeter, and it has a kind of a smooth body to it. You start to get these flavors people aren't used to seeing as you get to higher altitude coffees. This is like where the farm's actually at, the soil that it's grown in. And so, we have some Mexican out there that we're going to roast today. We have Guatemalan. We have Ethiopian out there. We got the ones that actually, the type of beans that give you a chance to taste stuff inside coffee you're not used to tasting. I say that like as though none of you guys have gone down this rabbit hole of like, maybe some of you guys look for this, but things like I'm not used to tasting citrus in my coffee, right, until I started to get into this, or like floral flavors inside of it. So you'll see these in coffees that are higher altitude coffees. Another thing to keep in mind with higher altitude coffees is they take a different profile of roasting, right? So the bean has a different density to it and water content, so you have to roast it slightly different. And a lot of the machines have built-in things saying, are you roasting a high altitude coffee? And they'll react that way. So they'll actually, they'll use a curve that actually, highlights that. So this is just kind of another description of that last slide, which is talking about like, when you're selecting beans, if you choose these general areas, this is the kind of coffee that you're going to get. Like if you like that Kona type coffee, you're probably going to want, if you want something that's like acidic and bright meaning that you'll be like, it's almost like your taste sensors like, wow, there's a flavor I wasn't used to seeing, right? It's kind of in like the headphone world, I've also gone on this route of like audiophile. In the headphone world, they have this concept of like soundstage. A really amazing soundstage would be like a bright Hawaiian coffee. But these are full-bodied ones where there's a lot of flavor to it. Go ahead.
Is the same question about bitterness? Is there anything in varying regions that altitude which to run?
Some of them are more prone to bitterness, but I think it has a lot more to do with the roasting method, right? And then how far you roast it.
It also depends on what you perceive as bitter. Some people will say dark roasted coffee is bitter, but to others, they won't describe it as bitter. They'll use different descriptors. Some people will describe a coffee that has more citrus as bitter because it's like sometimes it's like a grapefruit or a lime or a lemon. So
Like for
The question when I saw the word acidic. So,
yeah, and well, this is a great point. Like, so for example, do any of you guys think cilantro tastes like soap?
There's a guy that I think that he does.
Yeah, so.
There's a percentage of the people in the world that always have that.
Yeah, it's like a bitter tasting thing. It's just the way your brain processes bitter flavors, right? So I am in that camp that you were talking about where I think the more darkly roasted a coffee, the more bitter it is. And I have a hard time drinking things that are past like a full city plus, right? Anything roasted into second crack, I think tastes better. But I've given friends of mine coffee that has oil on the outside. It's like all the way to Vienna French roast. And I'm like, I would not drink this. It is really bitter. And they come back and going, that was delicious, right? So it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. Like if you kind of understand how you like to prepare coffee, what you're used to drinking, and then also it affects it whether you like milk in your coffee or not. So this is the point where I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go out there and roast some machines, or not roast machines. We're going to roast on some machines here. And luckily, Chris brought his Huki roaster, drum roaster. We have two different drum roasters to test on. The B-More, which is the entry level. This is the entry level, very affordable drum roaster. Takes about 30 minutes to do a batch. So we're probably going to be able to do 2 or 3 batches on this. The Sauna Fresco is pretty fast. It does a lot at one time. and it's more of like in the $3,000 range. So it's like after you've wedded, you've decided that you want to get into this and you just don't want to be doing a pound at a time. And then the hookey, which is about $1,200, $1,300. And you can really fine tune the roast here. Like you can like start to really adjust like bitterness and like the stages of development with the hookey. So maybe we can break into groups and we'll go through and like let the people, like Chris will show people on the hookey and I'll show people on the beam more on the Sonafresco how to do it and let you guys roast on some coffee. So, go ahead.
I got a quick question. Early on, you talked about staleness of beans, and
Yeah.
as consumers, that's kind of like our biggest problem with that.
Yeah.
There's long shelf life, in which
Yeah.
the staleness is. As a consumer, would stuff like vacuum packing beans that were not, like for instance, we make coffee at home during the weekends.
Mm-hmm.
So would it be beneficial to vacuum packing said beans over the week?
So, okay, so this is also a very controversial kind of like, there's people that argue about this. And then there's chemists and scientists that probably could speak really authoritatively on this. In my experience, like I remember when I was growing up, people used to freeze their batteries because they thought it would keep it better longer. It turns out that doesn't really help. In fact, it might be negative. And then I know people would freeze their coffee for fear that like warm temperatures would do that. There is some science behind the temperature and the humidity level of where you store the green beans and also the roasted beans. But I think, in my opinion, most of the effect comes from the date from which it was roasted. And there's the common practice in the industry right now is to put like an expiration date on coffee beans that have been roasted. I think that's largely so that the person that roasted the coffee can make a determination on what they consider fresh. I prefer to like put a roasted on date so I can give you guys a chance to be like, hey, actually I like coffee that's been a week to 10 days. I think that the freshness of the beans has more to do with it being between the optimal consumption time is going to be between 48 hours, 24 to 48 hours, to like 10 days at the max. After 10 days or so, I'm starting to think the coffee doesn't taste good anymore. It's not that it doesn't have caffeine in it. Like it'll get the job done. It's going to wake me up and get me to work. I'm going to pay attention, right? But it doesn't have those floral notes and the fruity notes and the stuff. They start to go away. There are products out there that people are selling now too to store your roasted beans that are supposed to help with that. Like they remove all the air out of it. They keep it in kind of a controlled environment. But I don't think they're minimally effective compared to like just getting coffee that was roasted about a week ago, right? Or less than a week. And most of the coffee you see in the shops, I'll let you jump in here in a minute, but most of the coffee you see in the shops you're not going to be able to tell when they were roasted. You're going to be able to tell when they say they expire. Some of the nicer shops will do that, right? There are coffee places, like there's one down in Kirkland that I like a lot that actually says when they actually were roasted. And I think that's an artifact of someone that actually really cares about what happens when coffee gets stale. So hopefully that answered your question. But
I was just gonna say there's a lot of debate about that exact topic. People will vacuum pack and freeze their coffee. I have a friend that does it. If he doesn't drink it before 10 days, he freezes it. He vacuum and seals it and freezes it. And then he'll dip into it when he's running low or he can't roast more coffee. I've tried it that way. I can't pick up on the difference as to whether it tasted better when it was fresh versus after it was frozen, but people get into heated discussions about that topic.
well, and I will say that, okay, so when you're roasting coffee, there's a reaction that happens. It's kind of like a catalyzing something, right? It starts, and then there's a shelf life that happens after that. If you roast to second crack, you've started that right there. If you roast before second crack, that's why you start to see the oils on the surface and stuff. If you roast to below second crack, before second crack, it starts when you start to let it age, right? Or when you grind it, right? So if you ground the coffee, it's going to be stale really quickly, right? You've released those gases, right? But you'll see bags with those degassing valves in there, and that's in there for a reason, because they start to, as they're aging, they're in this time frame where they're aging, they're starting to put off gases, and the bags fills up, and it needs to let that gas out without letting oxygen in. So, there is some level of, I would say it's smart to say that you want to expose as little oxygen exposed to the beans as possible. And so, but I don't know if cooling versus not cooling has an effect, like freezing or not. But I think beans that have been sitting out in an open container in open sunlight for less than 5 days after roasting still taste better than the ones that have been vacuum sealed but it's 2 weeks old, right? It's still fresher for me for the ones that are, it's just less than 2 weeks. So, okay, so let's break into some groups, and then afterwards we'll talk a little bit about hacking the different types of roasters, if you still have patience for that. So we're gonna break, go into that room.